Okay, thank you everyone for being in this guest lecture, very special guest lecture. I would like to welcome you to Dr. Hall. She is Senior Advisor at the Responsible Data AI at the Office of the Chief Information Officer at Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. So I would like to hand this lecture to Dr. Hall, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here to be speaking with this group. I'm going to share some slides and hope that it works. Let's see about that. Okay, is that sharing the right slides?
It says it has started sharing. Okay, we can see your slide.
Okay, perfect. So I'm super excited to be here. I'm a senior advisor on the Responsible Data and AI team in the Office of the Chief Information Officer at Treasury Board Secretariat. So our team is responsible for setting the policy and providing guidance on the responsible use of AI and the ethical use of data across the government. So today I'll be talking about some of our team's work, specifically on the policy tools we have to be able to support the responsible use of AI. So I'll move on to the next slide. So in the GC, or Government of Canada, AI has been used for many years. You can think about some early uses and things like satellite imagery, weather models. And nowadays, we're seeing more and more examples to support better service delivery, as well as to extract information from large amounts of data. So the two arrows on this screen are pointing to risk scoring and fraud detection. And those are falling within our policy, the Directive on Automated Decision Making, that I'll go into much more detail today. In the GC, in terms of AI usage, there were some parliamentary questions in 2023, and analysis suggests that more than half of the departments were using AI at that time. But since then, generative AI came out, and so we expect that the number is now likely to be higher. We also see that there's a big variability between departments. Some people have been using this for many years, whereas other departments have been just starting to experiment in this area. And so the team size as well is very different. We're seeing too some applications coming out of the generative AI tools, whether you're thinking about summarizing information or using different chatbots and things like that. So when we're thinking about AI, we really need to think about two of the main issues. Number one, bias. So these systems are known to discriminate and to amplify the historic bias. This is often captured in the training data and it can then be amplified. So a couple examples of that you might have heard of. With facial recognition technologies, with a lack of representation of different training data sets, it doesn't work equally well for different population groups or based on gender. Another problem or another example of bias is seeing bias in the training data. So there was a tool from a popular company out there that was used for hiring, and the hiring algorithm favored male candidates. And this was because when they looked at it more closely, they took it out of commission. And when they looked at it more closely, they realized that it was because the system had been trained on the resumes of previous applicants who were predominantly men. So that's one of the main issues is bias. These systems can have these biases. The other main issue is explainability. You might have heard of the black box problem. So these can be very, very complex to understand. And you need to be able to know how the system arrived at a prediction or a classification. And this is particularly important when you think about high complexity systems and the idea that as a government, we're providing services. And if we're using these tools, we need to be able to explain why a decision on service to an individual was made. And so the explainability of AI models is incredibly important, especially when you think about these types of decisions that impact people's lives. So ultimately, this comes down to public trust. So AI is attractive. we've seen lots of potential benefits from these systems. Organizations want to automate their operations to be more efficient, accurate, consistent, and in some ways interpretable as well. But it's not always easy to get this right. There's risks of biases, as I've mentioned, and lack of explainability. There's also issues with, public concerns about using these tools that we need to be very aware of and mindful of. So how do we counteract some of these problems? Well, we need quality assurance, transparency, impact assessment, and human oversight. Those are some key things that we can do to make sure that when we're using these tools, they're being used responsibly. And for this, we need rules. So speaking of rules, the team that I work for, the organization I work for, is Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. So I've mentioned that a couple of times. Treasury Board is a committee of federal cabinet ministers. Sometimes you've heard it called a cabinet committee. So Treasury Board was established in the Financial Administration Act, and that act sets the responsibilities of Treasury Board. And there's two main areas that you can think of that it sets the rules. That it has in terms of what it does. One of them is that it sets the rules for the public administration. So administrative policy is what this is called. You can think about areas like human resources, financial management, the management of technology, cybersecurity, security, things like that. Treasury Board sets the rules for that. As well, Treasury Board makes decisions on government funding or authorities. And so this financial management is a powerful tool to have in the toolbox of Treasury Board. So that's Treasury Board, and I work for Treasury Board Secretariat, which is an administrative arm of the Treasury Board. And so it's a central agency, and our team's role is to establish the rules and policies with regards to responsible AI. So this is the policy framework for Treasury Board. It's a hierarchy. I haven't expanded all of them on the left-hand side here. The only ones I've expanded are the ones that are highlighted. And that is under the policy on service and digital. And what I've highlighted are our instruments that I'll be going into more detail today. This is mainly to provide context. So the Directive on Automated Decision-Making, that's a mandatory policy tool. We have our guide on the use of generative AI, and you won't see it here on the left, but you'll see it on the right-hand side. That's one of our tools, and our Algorithmic Impact Assessment tool. So those are the three things that I'll be mainly talking about today. So the Directive on Automated Decision-Making. The directive is a mandatory policy instrument. People in the federal government institutions need to follow it. It was released in 2019 and then was updated in this April of 2023 following its third review. So we do a regular review of these policies. The directive seeks to ensure transparency, accountability, and procedural fairness in the use of automated decision systems, including AI, in the federal government. So now this directive applies to systems used to make or support administrative decisions or related assessments impacting clients. So clients in this case can be things like individuals, businesses, public servants. Those are a lot of the different clients that we're talking about here. And when we're talking about an administrative decision, these are decisions that impact on the rights, interests, and privileges of an individual. So we sometimes get asked, is this a directive on AI? And the answer is yes and no. So it's yes, if the AI is used to support an administrative decision. And this can be the case in things like risk assessment and fraud detection, using automated decision tools when you're thinking about benefits delivery or permits. But no if it's for other purposes. So there are purposes that are outside of scope, such as chatbots or the use in office tools or science, for example. So this really has that focus on administrative decisions and automation of those. So what are the goals of the directive? Many Canadians worry about government use of AI and automation. And over time, these expectations have grown about how we would use AI. People want us to make sure that we don't have biases in these systems, and that's completely fair. People are worried about bias and the concerns of automation, about we don't want AI to go wrong, right? We want to make sure that our use is effective and responsible, and that it's fair, of course. We also need to make sure that what we're doing is transparent. Both the where we're using this, so letting people know where a system is being used, and also how it's being used. So how does it factor into a decision-making process? How are people impacted by this? So overall, we want to make sure that decisions are fair, accurate, and consistent. And this can't be something that happens after. It needs to be proactive. And so we need to make sure that we're assessing impacts and minimizing them before we even put a system into production. This is a must. We need to do this. We need to make sure that the systems are of high quality. And this is so important for trust. And so when we do our work, we need to make sure that we're communicating it. These expectations are out there, and we feel it's very important that we do meet them. And so the directive is what we have in place to help departments to meet those expectations. So the scope of the directive, I spoke a little bit about it a couple slides ago, but in April of 2023, it was updated to include both internal and external services. So this means if we provide a service to someone, then they are likely to be subject to the scope of the directive if an automated decision system is used. So you can think that this could be employees, like if it's used in a hiring process, citizens, if it's used in benefits delivery, people from other countries, if they're looking at immigrating to Canada. So these are three different areas where we do have different client groups, but all of them deserve to have the protections of the directive in place. Now, again, the second one here that I'm talking about is administrative decisions. So these are decisions, as I mentioned, that impact the legal rights or privileges of individuals. Chatbots, not in scope, but systems deciding on benefits or permits, who to audit, yes, those would all be in scope. And then number 3 here is systems making decisions, but also related assessments and that are used by government officers. So I'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, but this is an idea that if it's somewhere in the process of making a decision, this automation, putting forward a risk score or flagging particular individuals, like things like that would all be within scope of the directive if it's for helping an officer make that final decision. As well, this is for any technology, but not only AI. So earlier I spoke whether or not this is all uses of it, whether it's a directive on AI. No, but yes, as I said, but it's also broader than just AI. There's a lot of other types of technology that can help to automate this judgment or discretion by an officer. It could be something like a simple rules-based system. But if it is making that kind of a judgment or discretion, then that would also be within scope. So it's not just complex AI systems. And the last one is that it's systems that are in production. So we want to make sure that we are balancing innovation with these factors of risk. So if you're doing research, if you're doing things in a sandbox, doing your technologies trials and also those type of things are not in scope. However, things like a beta test where you do have actual client data being used and inputting into clients, those would be in scope. So there's a fine line there, but it really is looking that research purposes are not within scope. So you can see here, there's a number of different factors that figure into the scope of the directive when you think about a system. So what's happened is we've recently published a guide on this, and it's the guide on the scope of the directive on automated decision making. And it has a large number of different considerations in assessing whether a system is in scope or not. I've mentioned a lot of them here. A few others are whether or not this is used by a department, and then whether it's developed after April 1st, 2020. So that's another feature of the directive, is that it's forward-looking from April 2020, with the exception of whether there are systems from before that that have been upgraded. So if you're upgrading the analytical capabilities of a system or using a system to deliver a similar service, that could then mean that you would need to comply with the directive. So there's a lot of different cases here, but we do have that guide here that we'd be happy to share with you as needed. It's available online. So I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by like a partial decision, that it's not just making a final decision, it's also if you're providing a recommendation to an officer. And this slide here really does show how you can go from decisions, which are at the bottom, where a system has the authority to make a final decision. And all the way at the top is where it's presenting just different information to the decision maker. But in the middle, there are things like providing assessments and presenting information from other sources. And anywhere along this spectrum, including having a person make the final decision, does not change that you do need to comply with the directive. So anything on this screen would be within scope. So this is a summary of the overview of the Directive on Automated Decision-Making requirements. I won't discuss them all. There's a lot here, as you can see, but instead I just want to highlight the 4 pillars. The first pillar is the Algorithmic Impact Assessment. Departments need to complete and publish this. I'm not going to go into more detail now, but this is where I'm going to talk about in a couple slides. Another area is transparency. So this is providing notice before use so that people know that these systems are being used, but also explanation after. And so that explanation helps to mitigate that risk that I mentioned earlier with regards to a black box technology being used. You need to be able to explain how the system made or contributed to your decision. There's also a big focus on quality assurance. So testing and monitoring the data for, as well as the algorithm, for biases and undesired outcomes. So that is one of those aspects that's really important to make sure that we don't have biased systems, to be constantly and frequently monitoring the system before, as well as considering doing it after as well, monitoring it as it's in production. There's also making sure that there's human elements involved, such as consulting legal services and human in the loop. And finally, offering recourse. So we need to make sure that clients can contest a decision. And overall, when you're thinking about this, there's a number of different assessments that occur. The Algorithmic Impact Assessment is one of them. The Gender-Based Analysis Plus is another one, and that also is another requirement that helps to assess the potential for biases in these systems. And of course, evaluating the results of the system. Now I'm going to move on to the Algorithmic Impact Assessment, which is a tool that supports the directive. This is a mandatory questionnaire, and it helps departments to identify and manage the impacts of their system. Now, this is an online tool, and it's open source, so you can actually find the information you need on GitHub, as well as Canada.ca has the tool itself. The questionnaire has more than 80 different questions. And it looks at factors like the data, the algorithm, the impacts, and mitigation measures that have been undertaken. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So the questions are each scored, and the end result is you get an impact level. Level 1 is low impact. Level 4 is very high impact. And the different impact levels mean that you have different directive requirements associated with them. Some requirements apply to all systems. Others are going to vary in terms of the impact level. So you want to have more diligence in some cases where it's a much more important and meaningful life decision. as opposed to something like perhaps a camping reservation that wouldn't be quite as meaningful as a parole or an immigration decision. So we really wanted to make sure that there were different requirements, different levels of due diligence for this quality and quality assurance for these different types of decisions. We also have higher transparency requirements for some systems to make sure that we have trust in place. Again, this allows us to try to balance innovation and responsible use. We don't want there to be too many requirements for those less impactful uses. So I mentioned that there's this risk areas and mitigation areas. So these are the different areas that are assessed with the Algorithmic Impact Assessment. The risk areas are on the left-hand side. The first one is the risk profile. And this is really asking questions about the context. So will it impact vulnerable populations? Is it an area of public scrutiny? These help to assess what the context around the use of the system is that might heighten the risk. Reasons for automation really is looking to make sure that we're explaining well why automation has been chosen in a specific use case. Were there other approaches considered? What are the client needs that are driving the use of the system? This is really making sure that the use of the system has been well thought out and proportional to the questions and the use case itself, so that we are making sure that the benefits and the risks have been carefully weighed. So system, what will the system do? Does it generate content? Does it do image recognition or text analysis? The algorithm gets into whether or not it's explainable, and then decision. So this is where we really start getting into some more details. What business line does the decision pertain to? And finally, on this side, we have impact assessment. This is the key section of the impact assessment itself. It's looking at how long the decisions will last, whether the decision and the impacts are reversible, and what are the consequences on the rights, privacy, equality, economics, and environment. So this is really having people think through a number of different aspects and considering how their system will impact people. The next section on the right-hand side is mitigation areas. So the mitigation areas, we have consultations, which is both internal and external. There's also data quality, which is asking about questions about testing for biases, documenting data quality issues. We then have a big section on procedural fairness. And right now, this is focused on audit trail and making sure that we are recording key decision points, that we know who the authorized decision maker is, what version of the system was used. And when you think about these types of information, making sure they're captured, these are all really important to be able to provide an explanation to the client. And the last mitigation area is privacy. So if personal information has been used, have you done a privacy impact assessment, for example? So as you can see, there is a wide variety of topics covered in this algorithmic impact assessment. And because of that, it is essential to be working with a multidisciplinary team of program specialists, data specialists, people that have developed the system, access to information and privacy officials, users, as well as legal services. That consultation with legal services is essential. So the overall process, I've spoken to it a little bit. I want to point out here the light bulb. This is signifying that you need to be thinking about doing an algorithmic impact assessment pretty much right as soon as you've got an idea for a system. By doing this early completion, it allows you to understand what needs to be done during the subsequent development of the system, what consultations you need to take, what mitigations you need to have in place, and the due diligence that you have to do as you establish the system. I mentioned the scaled requirements a little bit earlier, and then you need to update the impact assessment and publish it right around production time to make sure that the impact assessment itself reflects the system that was actually built. So again, the progressive requirements. As I mentioned earlier, this algorithmic impact assessment is a tool to help us manage and minimize the negative impacts of these systems. When you think again about these different types of decisions that a system in government could be helping with or making, something like a $2 credit for a light bulb, that's not something that will have major impacts on a person necessarily. However, at the other end, immigration decisions, conditional release of prisoners, things like that are areas that we want a large amount of diligence and quality assurance. And we need to have the rigor in those cases, but the rigor can be a little bit less when we're thinking about those other use cases where there is innovation in how we allocate a $2 credit. So as I mentioned, this helps to assess what requirements we need to meet, because some of them are easier to meet and some of them are not always going to be as easy. And that's where those higher requirements for higher impact levels are needed. So what's the current state in the GC? We currently have 21 algorithmic impact assessments published on the Open Government portal. These are in a variety of different areas. Immigration is one that has quite a few of those different AIAs published. We also see some in public health, public safety, human resources. That's one that's come up in the last couple of years, as well as employment insurance. We're also aware that there are a number of other ones underway across the GC. So we've seen an acceleration in the last couple of years. There were 5 or so originally published, but we've seen it up to 21 now. So we're seeing more and more and more being published, and we expect that we will continue to see more published as time goes on and more people are starting to consider how to use these systems. And then the last part I'll speak about in terms of the directive and the algorithmic impact assessment is things we've heard from our stakeholders. So our team really likes to work in the open, and we consult our work. And as we do that, we do hear back about criticisms of our work, which really helps us to reflect on our limitations and the limitations of these tools. So what you can see on the screen are a lot of areas that we've heard of that we need to consider strengthening the directive or the policy suite in general in terms of AI. So some of the things that we have heard is that we need more transparency in the use of AI. So right now we require publication of an algorithmic impact assessment. And that is great for these tools that fall within scope of the directive, administrative uses. But as I've mentioned, not all uses of AI will be within scope. So people are looking for a public register of AI uses. Another area that we've heard some input is the need for greater public participation and deliberation. So this is another area we do consult, but we don't necessarily have mechanisms in place for all systems to be able to provide those input to the systems themselves, as opposed to us who's consulting on policy. We've also heard about the need for stronger oversight and governance of these published algorithmic impact assessments and making sure that all of the requirements of the directive are being met, and the need to integrate language relating to human rights. So we do talk about a number and have requirements in place that provide a number of human rights protections when you think about biases, equality, and transparency. However, we don't explicitly mention human rights anywhere in the document, and we do know that there is a gap in that regard. And finally, the directive scope. So I mentioned the guidance earlier that we've put out that explains the scope of the directive, but there are things and uses outside of the directive scope that could likely use some policy guidance. When you think about the use of AI in setting government policy, that wouldn't be in scope of the directive, but it could have impacts on people. And so that's another area that we're thinking about. Right now, we're working on the 4th review of the Directive on Automated Decision-Making. As I said, there's a regular 2-year review cycle now, and the last one happened in 2023. So we're working on that now, and the stronger governance and oversight and integrating human rights language are two areas that we're considering and moving forward as we continue working through the fourth review. Now I'll pause there for a sip of water before I get more into the guide on generative AI, because it's completely switching streams. Okay, so the guide on the use of generative AI. This is no longer talking about the directive and the Algorithmic Impact Assessment. Instead, what I'm going to talk about now is some guidance we issued last September. So it's over a year old now. And then we updated it in February. And this is the guide on the use of generative AI. This guide puts forward principles and best practices on how to use generative AI tools like ChatGPT and Copilot in a responsible way. So essentially, this is our outline. The guidance we established in 2023, after we had started seeing a lot of discussion in the media and getting lots of questions from departments and from public servants. Should they be using generative AI? Can they? Is it permitted? Is it not? Should CIOs be blocking it? And departments were starting to issue their own guidance as well. And we see a strong need for departmental guidance, but we wanted to provide this foundation for departmental guidance so that there would be consistency across the board that could then be further tailored to their own operational contexts. So in September, as I mentioned, of 2023, we published this guide. And this guide really is looking to empower users to use this AI tools responsibly, securely, and effectively. We start out with an overview of generative AI and then a brief section on potential uses and concerns. We then come forward with a recommended approach, which is that these tools can be used, but you need to be cautious. You need to mitigate the risks and align with the FASTER principles, and I'll be talking about those in an upcoming slide. And there's also existing policies and laws that must be followed. We then go into some policy considerations and best practices, privacy considerations and the applicability of the Privacy Act, as well as the directive, which I just spoke about. And then we have the core of the guide, which is a section of 7 different issues and best practices. And finally, we have frequently asked questions, which summarizes the guide in an understandable format. So the goal here is, as I mentioned, really to empower public servants to be successful using these tools. Help people to understand when they should and should not be using it, if it's appropriate or not, and how to manage the risks. So there are a lot. When we started working on this guide last year, we realized that there was a very large number of potential uses for these tools. There's things anywhere from drafting and editing content to generating images to helping to code to supporting research or brainstorming. And we also knew there were a lot of operating contexts in the government. So the government has social programs, it does immigration, there's science departments that do research, there's enforcement agencies. So there's just such a wide span of uses in the government. Because of that, and because of all the different potential uses, it was super important that the direction we provided would be broadly applicable across all of those different areas. We also knew that this technology was likely to be evolving quickly, and we wanted something out there that would remain relevant as the technologies changed. So what we put forward are the 6 different principles that you can see on the screen. The acronym is FASTER, and I'll just go quickly through all 6 of them. So the first one is FAIR. So there are known issues of biases with these tools. So it's super important to make sure that the content generated is appropriate. A lot of the training data is data that is on the internet. And so this is data that would be prevalent and would not necessarily capture all of the unique experiences. It also would have a lot of historical data out there that could be biased, and we wouldn't necessarily want to have that as our outputs. We also need to make sure that we're complying with human rights and other obligations. Accountable. This is really making sure that people are responsible for the content they generate. So it's my work, it's our work as public servants. We need to review it for accuracy and legality and make sure there's no biases. We also need to make sure that our management is aware. Secure focuses on the need to protect personal and sensitive information. So some tools, like the online generated web tools, are unlikely to meet the security requirements and privacy requirements of the government. So we wouldn't want to be putting personal information into a publicly available web tool. That would be unacceptable. Transparent really focuses on how important it is for us to be open about the use of these tools to support public trust. We don't want to mislead someone inadvertently that they're interacting with a human when really they're interacting with a tool, and vice versa. We also need to be identifying what content has been generated by these tools so that we are transparent about their use. Educated, this has a couple different aspects to it. First is that increased AI literacy can really help to understand how to appropriately use the tools. But on the other side, it's also really important that you're using these tools in areas where you have knowledge to review the outputs. So these outputs from the tools can be incorrect. And because of that, you need to be an expert to be able to validate that they're giving you the accurate information. I don't have a strong background in quantum physics, so it wouldn't be appropriate for me to generate something and pass it and say that this is the authoritative source for quantum physics, because I wouldn't be able to validate that. And finally, relevant. There are risks and consequences of using these tools. So it's really important that we have a clear need, whether it's user, organizational, and client, to be using these tools. So just because the tool is available doesn't mean you should always use it. And even though it's a guide on generative AI, we do say that. I mentioned 7 different issues and best practices. This is them here on the screen. So although generative AI has this huge potential to be useful, these are some of the challenges that we have. I've mentioned the possibility that we could be tricking somebody into thinking they're interacting with a human, but really it's a chatbot. And these are best practices both for use in the GC. So for example, I'm writing an email, I need it edited, and I provide it to a tool to help me with it. That would be within scope of this guide. But so are those cases where the GC is deploying these generative AI tools. So where they would be interacting, the public or other public servants would be interacting with a tool deployed by the GC. And there's going to be different due diligence and different issues when you are deploying a tool, and we've separated those out in the guide. So this is just a really quick overview of how we've handled this section. This is quality. So I've mentioned this generative content can be inaccurate or inconsistent with the source data. You've probably heard these called hallucinations. So this can be a really big problem, especially if you consider the government context. If we are using it for research, it could be leading to misguided policy if we're using this as our source to inform policy. Or if it's in a public-facing communications, there's a possibility for misinformation because there could be quality issues here. And you can see a few of the best practices here. They're easy to implement, such as clearly indicating that you've used generative AI to develop the content, and to validate the information, review it for both factual and contextual accuracy, and check with an expert if you're not one, or check authoritative sources. As I mentioned, we have a frequently asked questions section. The first set of 5 questions are all here in the very first line. And it's, can we use generative AI in different contexts? Coding, emails, public communications, policy, or administrative decisions. In each case, we provide a response which clarifies whether you should be using caution or if you can use it. And then some ideas about what type of mitigations and risk management techniques you need to have in place. So for emails, yes, you can use these tools, but use it only for unclassified information. Don't put personal information in there. Check for accuracy and biases and let your manager know. Another one we have here is checking for copyright protected materials. There's a couple cases in front of the courts right now where they are looking as to whether or not there has been copyright violations by training tools on previously published work. So we had a lot of questions on this, so we put some information out there on how you could check for copyright, potential copyright infringement. For example, you could do an internet search for matches. You could also choose your task accordingly. Instead of having the tool generate completely new information, instead you could ask it to edit something that you've developed yourself, and that'll really reduce that risk of copyright infringement. And finally, you can choose not to use the tool. Again, not all uses are going to be appropriate. If you're putting an image out for a publication, you could use a public domain image or a paid for stock image, for example. And finally, you can always check with legal services. So overall, the guide here is really meant to empower users. It's looking to encourage departments to explore how AI can help them. But before they use it, they need to be considering the risks and how they'll be managed. I'll also just briefly mention that we have another new product coming out next week. It is, well, when we developed this guide, we realized this guide was quite comprehensive and a bit lengthy. And because we had that type of information, we knew we wanted something shorter and easier to digest for everyday users. So we've developed a concise summary. It's anchored on the FASTER principles, which are highlighting the most important best practices for everyday use. And then it also includes clear do's and don'ts. So also highlighting, unclassified information, and, don't use this to generate harmful images, but you can use it to edit a document. If you're interested, this will be released next week. And I'm always happy to connect and share that as needed. So that was the end of my presentation. If anybody has questions, you can reach out to this email address here, and you're also welcome to ask questions now. So thank you very much for your time and for having me here to speak. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hall. And I would like to hand the floor to the student in the class who participate here. Anyone have questions? I can stop recording right now, and then it could be in interaction of the recording.